the subject of the lesson is sacrament. And I have put under that in my lesson book that what wonderful saying from Mrs. Eddy seems to me to dominate the lesson is this. It's citation 22 in Science and Health, page 25, verse 31, I think it is. The divinity of the Christ was made manifest in the humanity of Jesus. That these sacrament rituals that are discussed in the lesson were his concessions to mankind, that they may learn of their real identity as spiritual ideas, expressing God. And I'm very grateful for that particular sentence from Mrs. Eddy. The humanity of Jesus. Also, dominating my experience with this lesson is the sense that I'm getting more and more as I study of the connection between the Old Testament and the New. And there are some very clear instances of that in this lesson, and I will bring them out as we go on. The responsive reading is from Micah. And that's one of my favorite Old Testament prophets. Micah was one of the minor prophets. He wrote in the time of Isaiah. And his sentences are packed with damnation for the rapacity and the sins of mankind, then followed by forgiveness and the promise of restoration. In the last section of Micah, chapters 6 and 7, Jehovah is represented as holding a controversy with his people, pleading with them in justification of his conduct toward and reasonableness of his requirements of mankind. And then the whole book ends with a triumphal song of joy at the great deliverance that Jesus will achieve, and a full acknowledgement that Jehovah, will achieve, and a full acknowledgement of his mercy and faithfulness to his promises. It ends up on a very high note. Now this is interesting, I think. The last verse in Micah is included in the Song of Zechariah in Luke 1, 72-73. Zechariah was the husband of Elizabeth, who was the mother of John the Baptist. He went very quiet. Yes, he did. And he couldn't talk until the time of the naming of John, because people wanted to name him Zechariah. But Elizabeth said no, it should be John, and at that point, Zechariah's voice came back to him. And he says in chapter 72-73, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all that hate us, to perform the mercy promised to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant, the oath which he sware to our father Abraham. And so that essentially is in Micah also, and appears in the voice of Zechariah. Excuse me, I dropped the Bible of all things. That's the same chapter that Luke 1, in which we have the Magnificat of Mary. You know that wonderful praise of God when she knows that she has been chosen to perform for God. Let's see if I can just get a couple of those words. And Mary said, this is verse 46, my soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior. For he hath regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. For behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. For he that is mighty hath done to me great things, and holy is his name. And his mercy is on them that fear him from generation to generation. And it's later on in that chapter that Zechariah gives his statement at the birth of John. Okay, so it's one of the I think it's a very interesting realization that a great deal that is in the Old Testament is repeated in the New. I have this new Bible study pastor. He's a Baptist pastor, and he could quote the whole Bible to you. He knows it so well. But he was working with Noah, and he spoke about the directions that God gave Noah to put a window in that looked up and one door. And then he referred us to a verse in the New Testament where Jesus says, I am the door. Kind of, he too is bringing out that the Christ was always in operation. And I think that's wonderful to hear from a Baptist minister. Don't you? He speaks very loud, but nevertheless, what he says is very thoughtful, and I think sometimes very enlightened. Okay, then in Jeremiah, of the responsive reading, we have this direct statement from God. This thing commanded I them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and ye shall be my people. And before that he said, I did not command them that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. But this thing commanded I them, obey my voice, and I will be your God. And so we have the spiritualization, or the realization of our spiritual nature, is what is achieved through sacrament. Okay, section 1 comes from Malachi, another one of the minor prophets, and he's the very last book in the Old Testament. And here's some interesting things about Malachi. He was the last of the prophets. We know nothing about him beyond his book. He belongs in the time of Nehemiah. Remember, Nehemiah was the rebuilder of the temple in 432 BCE. His prophecy was to aid in the great reformation then needed. The Jews had suffered defeat against the great Eastern powers like Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, and now must rebuild spiritually and materially. Malachi believed in a spiritual worship as the one essential of true religion. But the temple ritual and sacrifices were in existence, and the prophet seemed to recognize it as a way of educating the people into a spiritual life. And that seems to me to tie in with Jesus. The divinity of the Christ was made manifest in the humanity of Jesus, in his sometimes concessions to matter, to sacraments, to teach of spirituality. Mrs. Eddy seems to bring that out later on in one of her citations. He also, there are only 4 chapters in Malachi. But in those chapters, when God is speaking, he is stressing the purification of the priesthood, that's so terribly important in so that man can be purified. He must have a pure priest. And in Hebrews, for example, just about the whole book, which is to bring Jews to accept Christianity as we know it, there is the great stress that Jesus is the highest priest after the form of Melchizedek, who was either a legendary or a real priest of great purity. And again, it suggests that the rituals, the sacraments that we follow, are kind of concessions, very brief concessions to matter in order to spiritualize thought. And Malachi speaks of purification, that the day of his coming, who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. So that justification, purity, very important as a sacred ritual. And then, of course, we have the baptism by John the Baptist of Jesus, who again concedes to be baptized. Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness. Then he suffered him, or he allowed him to baptize him, so that the Adam dream must be purged away. Mrs. Eddy speaks of Earth's preparatory school, and I think that the sacraments are part of that preparation. The definition of sacrament was interesting to me also, other than Mrs. Eddy's definition of baptism as purification by spirit or submersion in spirit. The dictionary says, sacrament is a visible sign of an inward grace. It's a visible sign instituted by Jesus Christ to symbolize or confer grace. Sometimes sacrament with capital letter is the Eucharist or Lord's Supper. And the definition of grace was freely given, unmerited favor of God, a condition of being in God's favor. And during the sacraments, I think mankind finds himself in a condition of being in God's favor. It is in this section 1 that we get the word concessions in citation 3. Jesus' concessions in certain cases to material methods were for the advancement of spiritual good. And then in citation 5, there are 3 words that I've encircled: willingness, gladness, and joy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So purity is stressed. Reminds me of what we hear at church. Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it does not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself, even as he is pure. In section 2 is that wonderful verse from Ecclesiastes that Mrs. Eddy gives the spiritual interpretation of. In Ecclesiastes it reads, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." And Mrs. Eddy, in citation 10, in other words, she says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Love God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man in his image and likeness. It's our nature to express our Father, Mother, that this is life and love and mind. And I think she says that the word duty was not in the original script. And having just read a book that speaks of the history of the writing scripts, that there could be a lot of distortion put in by a sleepy scribe. And we have to look very carefully and find the spiritual interpretation of the whole matter. Let's see. Then we have the section 3 is the Last Supper and the washing of the feet. And this is again a concession to humanity's needs to know how they are to love one another. And I think that's all. There are some churches that actually have a washing of the feet that take place. Do they really? I didn't know that. Any particular Sunday that they do it? Sacrament Sunday. Okay. Spring and fall. Have you ever been there during a washing of the feet? Okay. And you maybe haven't done it yet. I always worry about the condition of my socks or my stockings if somebody says that. Yeah, pretty bad. Okay. Interesting also, Mrs. Eddy uses the word manna, which of course is from the Old Testament, when she speaks of the Last Supper. His followers, sorrowful and silent, anticipating the hour of their master's betrayal, partook of the heavenly manna, which of old had fed in the wilderness the persecuted followers of truth. Their bread indeed came down from heaven. It was the great truth of spiritual being, etc. And I love, again, that connection between the Christ in the Old Testament and Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Okay, still in section 3 is one of my other favorite statements by Mrs. Eddy. She speaks of our Eucharist as being spiritual communion with one God, and our bread which cometh down from heaven is truth. And she says in the next citation, whatever holds human thought in line with unselfed love receives directly the divine power. I am still, and probably for eternity, will be trying to understand and fully feel what is divine love. I got some hint of it. I think I spoke of it last time we were together, about Mrs. Eddy being asked by one of her students whether Mrs. Eddy loved the student. And Mrs. Eddy just very quietly replied, after thinking a little bit, "I just love." And that's that unselfed love. Meekness and charity have divine authority. So that washing of the feet was to show that humility brings down blessedness, as well as we should love one another. So that the sacraments are, wow, are they loaded with power. Then we had the crucifixion, and it is on the cross that death died. I keep remembering that passage from some lesson. On the cross, death died, not Jesus. And that he turned there when his disciples fell asleep. Boy, am I guilty of that. There was no response to that human yearning, and so Jesus turned forever away from earth to heaven, from sense to soul. Yes, that's the garden scene. And this is a part that I'm not happy about, but of course I understand. It's like that passage, trials are proofs of God's care. It's taken me a long time to understand that. But she repeats that here. And some Christian scientist once told me to cling to the word opportunity when you're going through some kind of problem, to look upon it as an opportunity. I'm speaking to that Christian scientist right now. Remembering the sweat of agony which fell in holy benediction on the grass of Gethsemane, shall the humblest or mightiest disciple murmur when he drinks from the same cup, and think or even wish to escape the exalting ordeal of sin's revenge on its destroyer? So, that I must grow into, but I know it is the truth. Yep. Okay, so I've confessed my weakness there and gave appreciation for the idea of opportunity. And then there's that lovely morning scene where Peter, who understood about 1/4 of what he should have, said, I know it. It's just a wonderful example of how hard it was for the disciples to fully understand what Jesus was teaching. And Jesus just had to persevere and finally turned some things over to Saul by straightening him out and making him Paul. And Peter saith unto them, I go a-fishing, which is going the way back instead of forward. And this is section 5. And the other said, we also go with thee. And they went forth and entered into a ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. They couldn't go back. And what happened to them showed that they couldn't. And then when they came to the shore, there was Jesus. I think he instead, but when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore and said, don't you have any meat? And they said, no. Didn't I feed you, in other words, and explain to you? Well, then cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. And of course it was so loaded. And this is very interesting to me. They came from struggling with their nets with all those fish. And Jesus didn't go up to them and say, give me a fish so I can cook for you, and we'll have a nice breakfast together. he already had a fire lighted, fish cooked, and bread to feed them again, because it was necessary. It was a concession he made to matter to feed them again and try to spiritualize their thought. And they had the greatest teacher in the world, and he continued to be the greatest teacher by doing what was necessary to have them understand, by stooping down and lifting them up. And of course, it finally worked, and we have Peter later on in the lesson in Acts, section 6, and a wonderful healing that he had of a man named Aeneas, which had kept his bed 8 years, sick of the palsy. And when he said, in the name of Jesus Christ, get up and walk, this was signs following the understanding that Peter finally had. I shouldn't talk like that about him because, I'm not even close to what he knows. And all that dwell at Lydda and Saron saw him and turned to the Lord. That's the signs following that Mrs. Eddy says we must have. The Christ is present. The healing is now, is what and these sacrament rituals are to have us understand that the Christ is present and constantly healing mankind. And then the last thing I want to note is his purpose in healing. And I think we have to remember that. His purpose in healing, citation 25, was not alone to restore health, but to demonstrate his divine principle. In other words, to glorify God. And so endeth my commentary on a wonderful lesson. And I'm finding that the Old Testament is opening up to me with clear indications that the Christ is eternal. In the beginning was the Christ, and now is the Christ. And Christ is working to leaven the bread and have us recognize our spiritual nature.